you ever discovered a detail at a theme park and thought, there's gotta be a story behind that? Well, you've come to the right place. We're Amanda, Kevin, and Kim, the team behind Where in the Park, and we've spent years exploring theme parks and creating seek and find games that uncover the details that most people miss. And now we're diving into the history, stories, and secrets behind those magical details. So grab your curiosity, and maybe even a churro, and let's explore the parks together, one detail at a time.
Hello and welcome to the Where in the Park podcast. This is Kevin, and on this episode, we will be celebrating Disney California Adventure's 25th birthday, which was this past Sunday, February 8th, as well as National Ferris Wheel Day, which is the same day as Valentine's Day every year, February 14th, which is tomorrow if you're listening when this episode is released. So yeah, specifically, we are going to cover the history of Ferris wheels leading up to the first, and as we are recording here in February of 2026, the only permanent Ferris wheel style attraction at a Disney park, which is currently named the Pixar Pal-A-Round, found at the Disney California Adventure Park located at the Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California. Before I get started, I want to remind everyone that the Where in the Park podcast is brought to you by whereinthepark.com. Visit whereinthepark.com to pick up unofficial seek and find game packs to experience on your next visit to a theme park. We have games for all 6 Disney parks in the USA, as well as games for various Universal Studios, SeaWorld, Legoland, and Six Flags parks in the country. Visit whereinthepark.com, find the park you want to explore, add the pack to your shopping cart, and use discount code PODCAST10 to save 10% on your first order. Okay, so longtime listeners know that when I go over the history of a subject, I like to start at the beginning. That's why this story starts roughly 5,500 years ago when the wheel was invented in Mesopotamia. It was supposedly used for pottery. Also, did you know that the oldest surviving wheel is a wooden wheel from 5,350 years ago, found in modern-day Slovenia? Either way, none of that is actually that important to this story. So I'll jump ahead to just about 4,000 years ago when someone in Anatolia created the first wheel using a hub and spokes design. Again, not vital to telling the story, but I just like covering all of the bases. And truly, without someone figuring this out, someone else likely wouldn't have started creating rides out of the design. So bear with me. I'll skip the history of water wheels, but it doesn't take too much imagination to see how large circles rotating on their own influenced the original designers of wheel-based attractions. Instead, let's fast forward ahead a few hundred more years, getting us to Constantinople in 1615. Now, it's not that well documented, but there was a mention of a great wheel at a Ramadan festival included in the writings from a Roman traveler named Pietro della Valle from that year. Not long after, an English traveler named Peter Mundy, describing something similar in 1620 in Philippopolis. Constantinople was in current-day Turkey, while Philippopolis was in current-day Bulgaria. According to Google Maps, they're about a 6-hour drive on modern roads. Either way, both of those were described as man-powered wooden structures with chairs suspended from them that spun vertically. You know, like a Ferris wheel. This style of attraction gradually spread throughout Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, with ups and downs or Russian swings becoming a popular take on this attraction. We'll post some of the photos that we found of these on our podcast blog, which you can find at our website by visiting whereinthepark.com/podcast. But they essentially just look like a big letter X suspended in the air, with seats at the end of each line of the X, revolving like a Ferris wheel by 2 men pushing poles that control gears to make the right turn. Meanwhile, in the United States of America, the first recorded creation of a similar attraction was in Walton Spring, Georgia in 1848. A man named Antonio Maguino used an amusement wheel, also powered by 2 men, to bring in crowds to his rural park and picnic grounds. The following year, 1849, in Syracuse, New York, specifically September 11th through the 13th of 1849, guests of the New York State Fair were able to experience a similar ride. Just a fun fact, those 11th through the 13th dates were actually a Tuesday through Thursday. Did you know that the modern concept of Saturday and Sunday marking the weekend wasn't nationally adopted until 1932? Well, anyway, at the 1849 State Fair, 2 men who had been working on the Erie Canal, Samuel Hurst and James Mulholland, put together another hand-controlled attraction, this time a 50-foot revolving wooden wheel, which, like the wheels before it, had 4 sections with seats. We'll also post a drawing we found of this one on our podcast blog. So yeah, in 1848 and 1849, man-powered wheel attractions entertained thousands of people in Georgia and New York, and by 1861, Thomas Bradshaw invented the world's first steam-powered carousel. Now, I know this isn't the history of carousels, but let's get real. If Thomas hadn't figured out how to create a horizontal spinning amusement ride with steam power, it's likely that the idea of a steam-powered carousel on its side wouldn't have happened. In 1867, a man named Isaac Newton Forester patented and built what he called the epicycloidal diversion. This is considered the first patent on a Ferris wheel style ride. It included a series of 4 large wheels, each 30 feet tall, mounted on a revolving platform, which seemed like a cross between a merry-go-round and Ferris wheels, but the wheels only had 2 cars on each. It was installed at Mississippi Avenue in Atlantic City. In 1870, Charles W.F. Dare's aerial swing premiered. He sold these amusement rides with either 20-foot or 30-foot diameters with options for hand-powered or steam-powered operation. A few sources point to this attraction as a precursor to the Ferris wheel, but I haven't been able to find any photos or drawings of it, so if you have any laying around, send them over. But yeah, it could have been one of those rides that somebody installed as a wheel-based amusement ride in Atlantic City, New Jersey around 1870. I couldn't find anything to confirm this either, but it's brought up often as the likely inspiration for a man named William Summers to create the first observation roundabout in Atlantic City in 1891. This was a 50-foot tall amusement ride made out of wood and powered by steam. It included 16 seated sections that could hold 2 people in each, for a total of up to 32 people at a time. He patented his design in 1892, and a few others were built, including one in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and one in Coney Island in New York in 1892, and the other at Staten Island in 1893. Now, for those of you taking notes, we have mentioned many people along the way to this point, and you may have noticed that none of them have the name Ferris. But good news, we have reached that point in the timeline. I mean, I guess I could have mentioned him between the 1849 New York State Fair and the 1861 steam-powered carousel because he was born on February 14th, 1859, which, by the way, his Valentine's Day birthday is the reason why tomorrow is Ferris Wheel Day. But yeah, he really doesn't enter the story until right about now. I am, of course, talking about George Ferris Jr., or technically George Washington Gale Ferris Jr., the man whose last name represents the attraction we all know and love. So, what's the story there? Well, George was born in Illinois, moved around a bit, and included some time in California, by the way, and eventually earned an engineering degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Torrey, New York. After graduation, he went to work designing railroad bridges, trestles, and tunnels, as well as making several trips to Pittsburgh to inspect steel for the Kentucky and Indiana Bridge Company. Eventually, he joined a bunch of other graduates from his university in New York to form GWG Ferris and Company in Pittsburgh. They would soon add branch offices in New York and, more importantly to this story, Chicago. His firm was hired to inspect the steelwork for buildings going into the Chicago World's Fair, aka the World's Columbian Exposition. The Columbian name was in reference to this fair celebrating the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's sailing the ocean blue in 1492, 400 years earlier. If you're a longtime listener or a Disney trivia buff, you might remember this exposition as being the one where Walt Disney's father, Elias, worked as a contractor. We mentioned this in part 3 of our Windows with a View episode back in November. Anyway, that fair had been an idea since the late 1880s and had been assigned to Chicago by a vote in the House of Representatives on February 24, 1890. When they won the vote to be the city for the fair, they didn't have any architectural plans, nor had they even decided on a location for it. The committee in charge of the fair couldn't agree on what they wanted, but they did agree that the fair needed to have an icon that would rival the Eiffel Tower, which had been built for the World's Fair held in Paris in 1889. There were tower designs that were considered, including a design by Gustave Eiffel himself, but each time it was determined that those towers would just look like cheap imitations to the iconic Eiffel Tower. It was about 2 years into the project, in 1892, when Daniel Hudson Burnham, a Chicago architect and the director of the works of the fair, called out the architects and engineers working on the fair for not coming up with an iconic building. This was at a luncheon that was being held as a Saturday afternoon club, with the people working on the fair, and one of the engineers in attendance that day was George Ferris Jr. He was 31 years old, but he had an engineering degree and a company with his name on it when he took a blank scrap of paper and started drawing a plan for a large wheel attraction. There is a quote from George where he describes sketching out that idea and how he decided on the size, what to build it out of, and how many cars it would run, and the number of people it would hold. And, quote, my plan has never varied an item from that day. After he was done with his sketch, he showed it to the other engineers, and they suggested that he should just stop. Or, in 1892 talk, they advised him against soiling his reputation, and that his wheel idea could only end in disaster. Burnham, the guy in charge, had the initial reaction of, and I quote here, your wheel is so flimsy it would collapse, and if it didn't, the public would be afraid to ride it. Ferris, though, stood up for his design and eventually convinced Burnham to share his idea with the Ferris board of directors. And after they reviewed the blueprints he had drawn up, they promptly rejected the plan. He in turn spent his own money to pay for a feasibility study. At the time, that was $25,000, which adjusted for inflation is more than $900,000 in today's 2026 money. In the end, after having his idea refused twice, they finally gave in and approved his wheel on December 16, 1892. His company would go on to create the wheel, but it wasn't easy, with a severe winter with 3-foot deep snows and a financial depression known as the Panic of 1893 setting back the project. But the Ferris wheel opened to the public on June 1st, 1893, just over 7 weeks after the May 1st opening of the fair. Some sources say it was referred to as the Big Wheel, the Observation Wheel, or the Chicago Wheel, or even Mammoth Wheel. But vintage maps of the fair and tickets for the ride say Ferris wheel on them, so we'll stick with that as the official name. It was physically huge. At 264 feet above the ground, with the wheel having a 240-foot diameter, it rotated on a 71-ton, 45.5-foot axle, which at the time was the largest hollow forged piece of steel in the world. It was manufactured by the Bethlehem Iron Company, and it weighed 89,320 pounds. The wheel itself was steam-powered with two 1,000-horsepower engines. As for the ride, it had 36 ride vehicles, each one roughly the size of a railroad car, and they say that each could hold up to 60 people at a time, but it would have probably been a tight fit. There are a few sources from the time that state that the cars had seating for 40 people, but I'm not sure whether or not that's accurate either. For Marvel fans with Disney Plus, Season 2, Episode 3 of the show Loki included a scene with a recreation of the cars, which I assume was well researched. They show a few stools near the windows and plenty of standing room. As for the experience, there are a few different descriptions, but the one I like details the guests would spend around 11 minutes with the cars revolving and stopping to unload and load 6 times, followed by one 9-minute nonstop rotation, for an experience totaling in at 20 minutes. A few sources talking about the novelty and thrill of being on an attraction that lifts you 264 feet in the air like to point out that in 1893, we were still over a decade away from the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903. But hot air, and more popularly at the time, gas balloons, had been around for over a century. In fact, at the fair itself, there was a hydrogen-filled captive balloon that would take guests up to 1,500 feet in the air. Of course, that ride cost $2 and could only accommodate up to 15 guests at a time. So there were obviously many people who went on the Ferris wheel that missed out on the balloon. But that's not the point. Oh yeah, another fun thing to note, the Ferris wheel wasn't allowed to be part of the main section of the Chicago World's Fair, the area that Elias Disney worked on as a carpenter and building contractor. It was instead relegated to the midway. This was possibly because of how late in the project that it was approved, but also because of a worry that it would collapse. Many fairs and amusement parks today also have their Ferris wheel style attractions on their midways, which is typically an area with rides and carnival games. This 1893 fair is actually where the name for those midways came from. The section of the fair they refer to as the Midway was a stretch of parkland perpendicular to the fair's main area, which had been named Midway Plaisance around 20 years earlier. The word Plaisance either means place for boating, or it was just an old way of saying pleasance, which is a secluded part of the landscape or garden. It's also possible that the landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, who also worked on New York's Central Park, maybe just thought it was a pretty sounding word for a pleasant park. But either way, there are old maps showing the design for the Chicago South Park Commission, with an Upper Plaisance located where Washington Park is today, a Lagoon Plaisance, which is now Jackson Park, and was where the main section of the fair was located next to Lake Michigan, and Midway Plaisance, a narrow stretch of park between those two larger areas. If you visit Chicago today, all of that parkland is still there. In the middle of Midway Plaisance, which is what they still call it, you'll find an ice rink located roughly where the original Ferris wheel once stood. But yeah, back to the past. Remember that William Summers I had mentioned earlier? He actually sued Ferris in 1893, arguing that he had infringed on the observation roundabout patent. George Ferris actually acknowledged in court that he had taken a ride on Summers' wheel in Atlantic City in 1891. Many sources state that Summers won that case, but Ferris appealed and a judge decided that the Ferris wheel had improved upon the Summers patent design enough to not be an infringement. Summers would end up getting out of the amusement ride business after spending who knows how much money trying to defend his patent without success. I should point out right about here that George Ferris never trademarked the name nor patented his Ferris wheel design, which is likely the reason why the name Ferris wheel is still used. Also, I should point out that the attraction was popular, and despite the high price tag of $400,000 to build, it had 1.4 million riders, making its money back and even earning a profit. But Ferris did end up suing the organizers of the fair for not giving him his part of that profit. The first Ferris wheel, though, after the fair ended, was moved to Chicago's North Side, opening on the corner of Clark Street and Wrightwood Avenue in 1895, in a residential area not far from Lincoln Park. Local residents didn't love it, and it didn't do nearly as well as it had with all of the World's Fair foot traffic. Eventually, Ferris declared bankruptcy after being incapable of making payments on his debts. Then, in November of 1896, at the age of 37, George Ferris Jr. passed away. Many reports say that he died of typhoid fever, but there are reports that say exhaustion, financial difficulties, and a divorce led him to take his own life. We may never really know. I'm not sure exactly who was running the Ferris wheel company after Ferris's bankruptcy and death. Possibly his business partner, Charles Yerkes, but either way, in 1903, the wheel was purchased at auction by the Chicago House Wrecking Company for scrap and salvage for $8,150. Instead of scrapping it, though, it was dismantled and sent to St. Louis for their World's Fair, which was themed to the Louisiana Purchase. It reportedly took 178 railroad freight cars to transfer the wheel from Chicago, and it wasn't done being rebuilt until May 8, 1904. About a month after that fair opened. At that fair, they referred to it as the observation wheel, not the Ferris wheel. After the fair was over, though, it was eventually demolished by dynamite on May 11, 1906. Apparently, there were plans to ship it to Coney Island in New York, but it was determined that it would cost too much. And well, for various outlets telling the history of Ferris wheels, the story usually ends there, if they even make it this far. But if I close my eyes and picture a Ferris wheel, this World's Fair observation wheel with cars that fit between 40 and 60 people isn't the first thing that I think of. And, well, why is that? The original George Ferris Jr. wheel was fairly unique. If you want to experience something similar to his design today, you'll have to go to Vienna, Austria for the Wiener Riesenrad, or Vienna Giant Ferris Wheel, which was built in 1897 to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Emperor Franz Joseph I. Technically, the one there today is a wheel that was rebuilt in 1945 after the original burned down a year earlier, but the design, if only 200 feet in diameter, 40 feet less than the original, it still looks very similar to Ferris's, complete with the large cabins that resemble train cars. Other wheels like it included the Great Wheel of London, which only existed from 1895 to 1907, and the Grand Rue de Paris from 1900 to 1920. As far as I can find, giant wheels with observation cabins weren't built again until 1985, and even then it was only in Japan. And though those wheels were huge, the cabins weren't actually all that large. It wasn't until New Year's Eve 1999, when the London Eye opened, that large observation wheels with cabins with standing room that fit several people started becoming popular around the world again. But the truth is that the average person, or at least the average American, probably pictures a carnival or county fair style Ferris wheel when they think of a Ferris wheel. You know, a smaller wheel, usually with a bench style seat for 2 or 3, or a slightly larger wheel with a seating area for between 4 and 6 people. This is because after going on the Ferris wheel at the 1893 World's Fair, there were people who walked away with a similar thought that George Ferris had after he got off the observation roundabout. Something along the lines of, hey, I bet I can make one of these. An example of this is George C. Tillieu, a man who kind of led the way for amusement parks here in the United States. He eventually built Steeplechase Park at Coney Island, but his first amusement ride was a smaller clone of the Ferris wheel that he had the Pennsylvania Steel Company build in 1894. Apparently, George Ferris had turned him down on his offer to purchase the original, so he went home to New York and put up a sign saying the world's largest Ferris wheel would be coming soon. Again, his wheel was smaller than the original, but he still advertised it as the world's largest because who was going to look it up? That wheel actually survived a fire that took out half of Steeplechase Park in 1907 and was moved instead of being demolished with the rest of the park in 1966. It was eventually deemed unsafe and was dismantled in January of 1975. Another person was W.E. Sullivan, the founder of Eli Bridge Company. As the name implies, he started out making bridges, just like George Ferris. Eli Bridge started making portable Ferris wheels after Sullivan went on the original Ferris wheel in Chicago. The Big Eli wheel debuted at the Jacksonville, Illinois Central Park in 1900, and they're still making wheels, as well as a few other styles of amusement rides today. And one more person mentioned here is Jay Conderman, whose J.G. Conderman Company began creating portable Ferris wheels in the early 1890s. They actually sued W. Sullivan's Eli Bridge Company in 1904, but they lost the case with it being determined that nobody could own a patent on Ferris wheels unless something new was added to their design. Their factory burned down in 1910 and they didn't rebuild. But yeah, other companies that have gotten in on the Ferris wheel game include RCS, or Ray Kamek Shows Incorporated, which has been creating amusement rides since 1963. Then there's Vekoma and Chance Rides since 1967, and Intamin since 1973. And I'm sure there have been many more before and after. But these companies, for the most part, weren't building huge wheels with large cabins. They were more intimate and less expensive than George Ferris's design, and they're what most people think of as Ferris wheels. And just a reminder, this episode is about the Pixar Pal-A-Round at Disney California Adventure, which isn't a normal Ferris wheel. Before I get into that, though, I do want to point out that Disneyland did try out Ferris wheels during a couple of 2-month-long autumn celebrations in 1987 and 1988. There was one wheel installed in front of the train station while the other was placed in front of the castle. This was part of CEO Michael Eisner's attempt to get more people into Disneyland during the off-season, with state fair-themed events happening both years. I couldn't find a source confirming it, but the photos show what appears to be classic traditional cable drive number 5 Big Eli wheels, originally designed in 1912, and still available for purchase from the Eli Bridge Company today. There was also a map from 1988 that showed a Ferris wheel kind of near Big Thunder Mountain. I couldn't find any photos or videos to prove it was ever really put there, so who knows. But either way, those Ferris wheels were short-lived, and some people say that location in front of the castle is why Imagineer Marty Sklar worked hard to get the Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse partner statue created and installed in that location of the central hub where it is today, to prevent another Ferris wheel from being put there in the future. Also, there was early concept art created for Disneyland by Bruce Bushman that included a generic-looking Ferris wheel in Fantasyland. There was another piece of concept art, also by Bushman, depicting a windmill-themed Ferris wheel type attraction, which wasn't built in Anaheim, but a little over a year after Euro Disney opened. A ride inspired by it was opened in June of 1993 in France. It was called Les Prouettes des Vieux Moulins, aka the Old Mill Swirls, but it would close in the year 2000. There has been concept art for Walt Disney World, which includes a Ferris wheel in the proposed Denmark Pavilion, and a pair of Ferris wheel ears accompanied by a Sorcerer's Apprentice-style hat for what was then the Disney MGM Studios, but those were never built. Okay, so let's talk about California Adventure. Back when it was first announced, it was described as a theme park where you'll be able to experience the glamour of Hollywood, the exhilaration of soaring over Yosemite Valley, and visit a gleaming California beachfront boardwalk. The concept art that they included in the 1996 annual report was very different than what we ended up getting. For example, it showed a large mountain with a bear head, but it looks like there's a waterfall coming out of its mouth. Also, they left off the beachfront boardwalk. We found another copy of the concept art in that report, but with the area where Paradise Pier would eventually be located not cropped off, but it does not include any rides around the bay. It wasn't until the 1998 annual report the concept art would appear with Paradise Pier looking closer to what it would end up becoming when the park opened. The prominent Ferris wheel had a sunburst at its center, but it did not yet have a face on it. It also didn't have the internal tracks that make the DCA Ferris wheel different, but it did have ride cars in unusual locations scattered around the wheel. Now, if you've never been to the DCA park in California, you might not know it, but there are 2 options for riding this Ferris wheel style attraction. The Disneyland website lists those options as swinging and non-swinging. The non-swinging version is described as a ride where you take off on a classic Ferris wheel adventure high above Pixar Pier, while the swinging is described with climb aboard for an exhilarating Ferris wheel adventure that swoops, swings, and slides high above Pixar Pier. You see, this is technically an Intamin coaster wheel. It is one of possibly 5 that have been built by Intamin, with this DCA version being the first and only one in the USA. The second was built for Hello Kitty Park in Anji, China 14 years later in 2015. The Intamin website doesn't list it, but there is an entry on Coasterpedia for Intamin coaster wheels, and they show another coaster wheel in Fuli Ocean Happy World, which is also in China, which they say opened in 2023. We found a photo of it, and it's definitely a coaster wheel, but we can't find any other information about it, so if you know more, please share with us. But the Intamin website does list the others, including one named Time Rider, which is in Gyeonggi World, which opened in South Korea in 2025, and a 5th one that is going to open at the Bon Luxury Theme Park in Vedante World in Nuevo Vallarta, Mexico. But that park isn't scheduled to open until fall of this year. That Mexico park is sometimes referred to as the Cirque du Soleil theme park, and it has been under construction since September of 2015, with the Vista Wheel having been completed with swinging gondolas installed since at least 2024, but possibly 2023. So, how did Intamin come up with such a wild design for a Ferris wheel? They didn't. They borrowed the design from Coney Island. Now, I remember my first visit to Disney's California Adventure way back in February of 2001, and I looked across Paradise Bay at the Sun Wheel, as it was named at the time, and I wondered to myself about which long-gone seaside amusement park may have had a Ferris wheel with moving cars on it. I was confused when I learned that Disney had based it on a Ferris wheel from New York, because it felt like that didn't make sense in a California-themed park. As far as I know, there's never been another wheel like it in California. There are reports that Disney Imagineering went to Coney Island with representatives from Intamin or Wagner Bureau working with Intamin to take notes on an attraction named Dino's Wonder Wheel. To be clear, Disney didn't keep its inspiration a secret. Their early promotional literature stated that it was modeled after Coney Island's 1927 Wonder Wheel. And even today, their website listing for the swinging gondolas, as they call them, explains that it's a unique attraction that is one of only 2 Ferris wheels in the United States that combines fixed and sliding gondolas. And they say it plainly, that the other one is the Wonder Wheel in New York's Coney Island. So, what is the Wonder Wheel? Well, if you ever find yourself at Coney Island, there's a section named Dino's Wonder Wheel Amusement Park. Like the rest of Coney Island, it's open seasonally, so check their website before heading down. But yeah, the headliner attraction at Dino's is the Wonder Wheel, a 150-foot tall Ferris wheel with a 135-foot diameter. It has 24 cars, 16 of them are swinging, while 8 are stationary, just like the original Ferris wheel. It was made from Bethlehem steel. Just for comparison, the Pixar Pal-A-Round is only slightly larger, at 160 feet tall with a 150-foot diameter. Now, I don't want to go into a long history of Coney Island here, so I'll keep it brief. I already mentioned George Tilyou's Ferris wheel clone being built in 1894, and how he eventually built Steeplechase Park in 1897. A decade before the wheel, the first roller coaster in America, the Switchback Railway, opened there in 1884. The next year, the first complete circuit roller coaster opened nearby, Gravity Pleasure Road. Different people kept adding new attractions, charging people to go on them as they went on. In 1895, that's a year after the wheel, but 2 years before Steeplechase, an other guy opened Sea Lion Park. That is considered to be the first modern enclosed park in the world, where there's a gate that charges admission just to enter. There is some debate whether Tivoli Gardens beat them to this back in 1843, so at the very least, it was the first in the USA. In 1903, Sea Lion Park was struggling and was bought by 2 other guys and was renamed to Luna Park. And then in 1904, yet another guy opened yet another park, this one named Dreamland. This was the heyday of Coney Island. It had 3 amusement parks in close proximity, and the area was packed with locals ready for a good time. As I mentioned earlier, in 1907, half of Steeplechase burned down. It would be rebuilt and reopened, I guess, by 1909. In 1911, Dreamland burned down, and it was not reopened. So yeah, my point is that it was kind of the Wild West of amusement park style entertainment over there at Coney Island. Okay, let's get back to the Wonder Wheel. The designer of the wheel was a man named Charles Herman. He had immigrated to New York from the Transylvanian Alps of Romania in 1907 when he was 17 years old. He got a job working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the Happel Iron Works in Manhattan. Around 5 years later, he moved to San Francisco. I'm not clear exactly what he was doing in California, but he did file for a patent in 1914 for an amusement apparatus that he called a perpetual motion machine. It was inspired by a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. After that, though, stories about him explain that he got a job from the Panama Pacific International Exposition, aka the San Francisco World's Fair, in 1915, where he and three of his friends traveled across the country on a donkey drawn wagon. They were apparently known as Four Jackasses and a Donkey. They received a letter of introduction from the mayor of San Francisco to the mayor of New York, stating that the purpose of their expedition is to see the country and, incidentally, to bear the message of our exposition across the continent. No one goes into detail about what this trip was like or how much they got paid to do it, but either way, after 3 years in California, he found himself back in New York. Apparently, it was a one-way trip. But yeah, the perpetual motion machine patent he filed was approved in 1915, and the same year he was back in New York, where he got a job as a custodian and manager for the Rochambeau Apartments, where a German immigrant named Hermann Garms was living. I'm not sure exactly how the conversation got there, but Charles told Herman about his perpetual motion machine patent, and Herman reportedly responded with how easy it would be to turn his design into an amusement ride. So, Charles redesigned the illustration and filed it for another patent, this time a Ferris wheel style attraction with loop tracks all around it. Charles and Herman formed a corporation named the Eccentric Ferris Wheel Company, and then tried to find a place to build it. They came across William J. Ward, whose father had owned a small bathhouse in Coney Island in the early 1870s, and when land divisions started being sold off, he purchased a full block of the property. They were successful and had various businesses of their own as well as concessionaires on their property. And there was one location that had recently become vacant. A switchback railway style roller coaster named Rough Riders had opened in 1907, but a design flaw made it where the trains could sometimes go too fast and overturn, which caused the death of 3 people in 1910 and then 3 other people in 1915, which is when it was finally shut down. So, yeah, they had a location, and William liked the wheel design enough that he also became an investor, offering the land in exchange for a share of future profits. Construction on the wheel began in 1918, soon after the end of World War I. Herman Garms raised money for the project by selling shares of stock to family and friends, while Charles Herman insisted that they use expensive Bethlehem steel, and they ran out of money 3 times during construction. Charles had all of the structural steel components fabricated on site and invented specialized tools to do the work, but for some reason he didn't patent those. But yeah, they ran into issues with design changes for the concrete foundation, and there were post war shortages of materials. Then there was the Great Steel Strike of 1919, which could have been a problem, but Herman Garms had hired non union immigrant workers to continue work on the project. Union officials showed up and complained about the non union members working on the project and tried to shut it down. So Garms responded by giving the workers stock, making them shareholders. He told the officials that they weren't workers, they were owners, and apparently that worked to allow them to continue working. The wheel was completed in 1920, not 1927 as Disney had incorrectly stated in their original literature, and it opened as a new kind of Ferris wheel, originally named Dip the Dip. The design worked just as Charles had hoped it would, but sadly, he had actually sold off all of his shares of stock to be able to afford to complete the project, and in the end had no ownership of the ride. When it was done being built, he left Herman Garms in charge of running it, and it was his family that would operate Dip the Dip for the next 60 years, renaming it to the Wonder Wheel in 1940. Charles Herman moved on, getting a job as a building superintendent, but he did design a scale model of what he called a giant coaster wheel, which he wanted to be 325 feet tall. He pitched it to the planners of the 1939-1940 New York City World's Fair, but they turned him down because they were concerned it would have made their 180-foot perisphere look too small. Just so you know, that's about the same size as Spaceship Earth over at Epcot. And if you look up photos of that 1939 Perisphere, you'll think that you're looking at black and white photos of the Disney park icon. Just interesting for us Disney fans, but not really that important to the story I'm telling right now. He would also design something called a gyroglobe, which was a ride inside of a huge steel orb that looked like a gyroscope. It was actually built in 1949 and operated at Coney Island across the street from the Wonder Wheel for many years, eventually being moved to Long Beach, California. It didn't really make any money though, and no other gyroglobes were ever built, and I couldn't find anyone talking about what happened to it after it went to Long Beach. So yeah, Herman Garms' family ran the Wonder Wheel until 1983, when Fred Garms, Herman's son, sold it to a man named Dinos D. Vorderis. The story, or at least one version of the story, is that Dinos had proposed to his wife in 1948 while they were riding the Wonder Wheel, and he made a promise that one day he would buy the wheel as her wedding ring. There's also a story about how he proposed to her in front of the Wonder Wheel. Either way, she was on the record as saying she never went on it again because she found it too scary. But the gist of the story is that he may or may not have had the money to afford an engagement ring at the time and promised the Wonder Wheel as her ring. Dinos had been selling hot dogs and other food from pushcarts in Manhattan and eventually operated a restaurant in Tarrytown. In the 1960s, he was operating a boardwalk restaurant while helping to manage a kiddie park that used to be known as Ward's, which was likely the same Ward family that Charles and Herman got the property for the Wonder Wheel from years earlier. In 1981, during what was likely the worst moment in time in Coney Island's history, Dinos bought Ward's because of his love for Coney Island and a belief that it would rebound. 2 years later, the Garms family was looking to sell the Wonder Wheel, likely because of the hard times at Coney Island. To paint the picture here, it said that Dino's wife told him that the Garms wanted to sell the Wonder Wheel to him while Dino's was in the hospital, recovering from a stab wound to the chest that he'd received in the park by a homeless man wielding a screwdriver. So there's that. But he bought the Wonder Wheel with a promissory note. He recovered from the stab wound and he invested money to restore the wheel at a time when nobody was investing in Coney Island. In 1989, the Wonder Wheel was declared a New York City landmark. And in 1999, 5 years after Dino's death, they renamed the street that the Wonder Wheel was located on to Dinos Vorderis Place. And well, it's still there, still run by the Vorderis family, and despite not having a manual, they were given a piece of cardboard from an old cigarette box with some scribbled instructions. They overhaul and repaint the attraction every year to keep it working well and protected from the elements. Also, a few years ago, Dino's son, I believe his name is also Dinos, updated the mechanical controls that have been used for almost 100 years to an updated computer system. But like I said earlier, it's not open all year long, so check their website, dinoswonderwheel.com, before heading over there. Now, I know what you're wondering. When the California Adventure version opened, was it the first time anyone else had tried to make an eccentric Ferris wheel? And actually, no. As far as I can find, it was the second copy. If you're a Disney theme park history enthusiast like me, you've probably heard of a park that used to exist in Japan named Nara Dreamland. That park opened in 1961, and there are stories about how it was supposed to be an official Disney theme park, with Walt Disney reportedly helping the founder of that park, with Imagineers advising on projects, because there was a plan to license the Disney name. But that licensing plan fell apart, so Nara Disneyland opened as Nara Dreamland. But it had a train station, a main street, and a castle that all looked very similar to the original Disneyland versions, and it even had a Matterhorn mountain with a roller coaster inside it. And it was a successful enough park that the owners quickly set on creating a second park, a little closer to Tokyo in Yokohama. That second park, which opened in 1964, wouldn't include any of those Disney-inspired icons, opting instead for some other buildings and one large Ferris wheel. And you guessed it, it was designed after Coney Island's Wonder Wheel. In fact, in the park, it was even named Wonder Wheel. According to Coasterpedia, it was 75 meters tall, which makes it the tallest eccentric/coaster wheel ever built, at roughly 246 feet. It was manufactured by Sansei Technologies, which if you look them up, you'll see they are still creating amusement rides, with photos on their website for Toy Story Midway Mania, The Little Mermaid, Ariel's Undersea Adventure, the Navi River Journey from Animal Kingdom, and more. Unfortunately, both of the Dreamland parks in Japan closed in the early 2000s, but there was just over a year between February 8, 2001 when DCA opened and February 12, 2002 when Dreamland closed, when both of the Wonder Wheel-inspired rides were operating at the same time. The Yokohama Dreamland Wonder Wheel was eventually demolished in 2004. But, like I said, there are a total of at least 6 on the planet today, and the swinging cars, or gondolas, are a thrill. I have often referred to the Pixar Pal-A-Round as the scariest ride at any Disney park. mostly because of the surprise at how fast it rolls, and how if you've been on other Ferris wheels, you know that they shouldn't do that. I'm not the only one, with people online sometimes referring to it as the Death Wheel, Wheel of Death, Wheel of Terror, Wheel of Doom, and other fun names. And I'm sure it has brought many children and adults to tears. But, knock on wood, the eccentric wheel design has never had an accident, or caused any injuries in its 106-year history. Yes, the rides can break down, including if there's an earthquake or if the power goes out, and you can get stuck on it. But when this has happened, they have been able to hand crank the ride to return everyone back to the ground safely, though it can take up to 2 hours. But don't worry, it's very rare for this to happen. But anyway, of course, I did mention that when DCA opened, this attraction was named the Sun Wheel. It had a large smiling sun on it facing into the park. That theming would change between October 2008 and May 2009 when it was redesigned as Mickey's Fun Wheel. This change was part of a $1.2 billion expansion of the park that had been announced in fall of 2007, with plans for the lagoon in the park to be updated for a nighttime show named World of Color. The new version of the ride swapped out the sun face for a large, pie-eyed Mickey Mouse face, and character art of the Fab Five, that's Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, and Pluto, added to each of the gondolas. The lighting on the wheel was also updated to multicolor LEDs, which would be incorporated into that nighttime show. That theming and name would stay for almost a decade, changing when Paradise Pier was converted into Pixar Pier in 2018. At that point, it was rethemed with Pixar characters depicted on each gondola, with two separate characters from the same Pixar feature animated film appearing on opposite sides of each gondola. For example, Sully's face is on one side with Mike Wazowski, both from Monsters, Inc., on the other for one vehicle, and with Wally and Eve depicted on another. The name at that point became Pixar Pal-A-Round. That pie-eyed Mickey, though, still faces into the park despite not being a Pixar character. Now, just to try to make some sense of this Ferris wheel at Disney California Adventure, let's recap here. George Ferris Jr., the guy Ferris wheels are named after, lived in California for a short while, as did Charles Herman, the guy who designed the eccentric Ferris wheel. Also, many seaside pier amusement parks that used to exist in California, including the Abbot Kinney Pier in Venice, Playland at the beach in San Francisco, and Pacific Ocean Park in Santa Monica, as well as amusement piers that still exist in one form or another today, including the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk, Belmont Park in San Diego, and the Santa Monica Pier. So it makes sense that the original designers thought it would fit into their pier-themed district. There's also the point that most, if not all, of those seaside amusement parks in California were built by people inspired by Coney Island in New York. Early concept art from Tim Delaney, who designed most of the early version of Paradise Pier, includes this Wonder Wheel-style Ferris wheel. I do not know exactly who at Imagineering pitched it, but knowing the public perception of Ferris wheels being iconic rides at seaside piers, and understanding that a basic Ferris wheel would be considered too boring for a Disney park, it makes sense that they would consider a unique design for the new park. It's also worth mentioning that part of the original idea behind the second gate at the Disneyland Resort was adventure, and that this park should have more thrills than Disneyland Park across the way. This is the reason why they had a whitewater rafting ride with a drop, and a roller coaster with a loop, and a Ferris wheel that makes people cry. Probably every day. But hey, I love the original Dino's Wonder Wheel, the version at DCA, and the rest of Disney California Adventure. And whether you love the Pixar Pal-A-Round as well or not, I hope you had a good time learning all about it and Ferris wheels in general. If you did have a good time, or at least learn something new, please subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And give us a like and a follow on YouTube. Also, don't forget to do all the other things, like joining our free private Facebook group, We're in the Park Explorers, and checking out our podcast blog at we'reinthepark.com. And while you're at our website, check out our unofficial self-paced seek and find games for DCA, Disneyland Park, and many other theme parks across the country. Okay, this is Kevin signing off for the We're in the Park podcast. Until next time, we'll see you somewhere in the park.
Thanks for exploring with us today. If you're ready to take your park experience to the next level, check out We're in the Park games. They're self-paced seek and find adventures designed for you to experience the park in a whole new way. Whether you're visiting for a birthday, a family gathering, date night, or even a solo trip, you'll be searching up high and down low for the details found in the park's theming. Get ready to discover a deeper appreciation for your favorite theme park with a We're in the Park game and take 10% off your next adventure by using code PODCAST10. Which park will you explore next? Until then, we'll see you somewhere in the park.